once again, and thanks for spending some time with us once again here on Leading Edge. I'm your host, Jeff Smith. Coming up a little later, the pressures of today and how we are supposed to help kids deal with anxiety and their overall mental health. But first, we want to let you know that we are recording this show on Thursday, August 31st. A lot can happen in a few days. We understand that. But at this time, there is still no deal between the UAW and the Big Three, with the September 14th deadline drawing ever closer. Also have to be upfront with you today. I am a news junkie through and through, so I consume news at all hours of the day. And thankfully for so many of us who love radio, there's WWJ 950 AM in Detroit, and thankfully they have a guy who lives and breathes all things automotive, and I am so glad to have him to join us here today to talk us through all that is happening and not happening with this stalemate. Let's bring in right now and say hello to Jeff Gilbert from 950 AM in Detroit. He is the Auto Beat reporter. Jeff, it is a pleasure to have you join us today.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for taking the time. And Jeff, I'm going to start off immediately with something that you and I have shared off air, but I'm going to read directly from the AP copy we received. United Auto Workers Union today, Thursday, saying that it has filed an unfair labor practice complaint against both Stellantis and General Motors for failing to make counteroffers to the union's economic demands. What's your read on this?
Well, it is just giving everything a push as we get into the stretch run. September's underway. The deadline is less than 2 weeks away. So the union is giving things a bit of a push. The union 4 weeks ago made its contract demands known. It says that Stellantis and GM hasn't responded. That's why it is filing the unfair labor practices claim. Both companies admit to be shocked. Stellantis calls this frivolous. Both companies say, look, let's get down to business. Let's get down to talking. Let's not worry about these labor relations charges. Why didn't they file against Ford? Well, they got an offer from Ford. Of course, they've rejected that offer from Ford, and the union and Ford have two different views on what that offer is. So, you can just say it's going to get bumpy from here.
Jeff, I had somebody ask me the other day, and I wanted to, I seized this opportunity to have you on the show this week, but I had them ask me, hey, hasn't it been the case in years past when one company was the negotiating party and then that set the baseline for the rest of the Big Three? Is that not happening this year? What has changed?
Okay, a lot has changed. I mean, we're starting a new baseline right now. It's possible that the union could decide to let one company set the pattern and then put the other two on the back burner. In fact, that's what the union in Canada is doing, and that's been traditional. But you can't use the word traditional this year because everything has changed. There's a new president in charge of the UAW, the first who was directly elected by members. His campaign was that he was going to put heat on the car companies. He says right now that all three are the targets, but I've been told by the UAW that does not commit to striking all three at the deadline. It's possible they could, but they have not decided the actual strategy as of the time we talked last, and they will determine that strategy based on what's going on in negotiations.
Jeff, let's talk for our viewers. Once again, Jeff Gilbert from WWJ 950 AM in Detroit joining us, the Auto Beat reporter. Jeff, let's kind of run through for our audience the sticking points that exist this year and what both parties are trying to solve.
Yeah, the sticking points, of course, first, pay is always the sticking point. So, the union has called for a 40% pay hike. Again, that's an initial demand. You can imagine they'll meet in the middle somewhere. The union wants
Hey, Jeff, let me stop you right there, because I think for those outside the game, we look at 40% pay hike, and obviously that's over the course of a many-year contract. However, bring us up to speed, is that out of the realm of what these other contracts have been? Is that too high?
Well, I cannot give, I'm not a judge on what's too high or what's too low, but it's certainly very high by historic standards. And the reason they pulled that number out, it wasn't pulled out of thin air. That's what they say the CEOs of the three car companies have gotten in terms of raises over the last contract. So that's where they got that figure. So, when you talk about things like this, opening offers you know the opening offer is a wish list. It's not going to be met. So this is where they started, and the union strategy is to, ask for everything and see what happens. I mean, it definitely is a shock and awe strategy.
So we're talking 40% as far as salary increase is concerned. What else are we looking at as far as benefits, pensions, things of that nature?
Yeah, they want pensions returned because newer workers get a more 401k style retirement benefit. They want cost of living adjustments returned. They also would like to see an elimination of different tiers where people, the union, or the companies call them in progression workers. Workers start at a lower pay and work their way up. The union wants to see everybody get the same thing. But they're not even on the same page when it comes to what has been offered. Ford sent a press release outlining what their offer was, and the UAW gave different numbers on their offer. So at this point, they're not even close.
I want to talk about the president taking on new tactics. Shawn Fain taking the leadership role. He was voted in. What is your read on the tactics going into this and kind of his personality, kind of, as you said, going full speed with this offer from the UAW?
Again, you have to understand the platform that he campaigned on was that the union was too cozy with the company. So, you have this first time because of the corruption scandal that workers are directly electing a president. The turnout was very low. The contest was very, very close, and Fain won. So right now, it's all of the old rules are out the window. We are not going to cooperate. Cooperation is the same as collaboration in their book, and they feel that they can get a better deal by going head to head against the companies. And even though they're talking about their initial offer, what nobody knows is what the union will actually settle for and what workers will approve, because at the end of the day, workers have to ratify any agreement.
Jeff Gilbert, stay right there. When we come back, I want to dive into a conversation talking about strikes of the past, what we have seen, how this affects communities going forward, especially right here in southeastern Michigan and northwestern Ohio. Jeff Gilbert from 950 WWJ joining us. We'll be right back. Continue our talk about the UAW and the Big Three right after this. Glad to have you back here with us on Leading Edge for this week. I'm Jeff Smith, your host. We want to bring back in Jeff Gilbert. He is the Auto Beat reporter from WWJ 950 AM in Detroit. Jeff, we were talking about the UAW, the Big Three, as negotiations continue, trying to figure out whether they're going to hit the picket line. And I wanted to ask you here today, specific to strikes and what we have seen over the years. We've had them here, you've had them in Detroit, what they do to not only the workforce, but also the communities. What's your read on all that?
Well, it obviously is difficult when people are not working. The UAW members will get $500 a week in strike pay for the time they're off. So that replaces some of the income, but obviously it has an impact on stores. It has an impact on other things in the community. So it will be difficult times. We saw during the GM strike in 2019, according to different statistical measures, Michigan for one quarter went into a recession because of that strike. So it does have an impact.
Public perception, anything there?
Well, that is where it is really interesting, because let's go back in history. There was a point where almost there were 3-year contracts, and almost every time there would be a strike against somebody in the 60s, 70s. In that era, it was pretty constant, but the Detroit Three didn't have much competition back then. Now there is the danger that, for example, if all three were shut down, well, somebody who might want a Ford Explorer will go down the street and buy a Toyota or a Hyundai or something like that, because those vehicles are still being made. So there is a real chance that if the inventories of the Detroit Three are cleaned out, but the inventories of the imports aren't, then the imports will get a sales boost, and those sales will be lost forever, and competitors will have new potential customers in the future.
What about dealers when we talk about that? Because, Jeff, we've done tons of interviews down here in the Toledo area talking to dealers who they still don't have much of an inventory sitting there on their lot.
Yeah, and that is a bigger issue now than it was 4 years ago with General Motors. And 4 years ago, there were big inventories heading into that strike. Now inventories are rebuilding from where they were. They're improved, but they're nowhere near where they used to be. So the impact of a strike is going to be felt very quickly.
Once again, Jeff Gilbert from WWJ AM Radio 950 in Detroit joining us, Auto Beat reporter, looking at this strike potential that we have between the UAW and the Big Three. Let's kind of get a read, your read specifically, that's why I got you here today, on the industry, where it's at, where it's headed.
Well, the industry, and here's one of the interesting things about these negotiations that make them very difficult. There are two radically different views of the industry. Both are correct. The UAW says the car makers are making huge profits right now. The last decade has been the most profitable one in the history of the Detroit Three. And they're correct. They're making big money. The car companies are also correct when they see more competition coming. They see costs coming to move to electric vehicles, and they see a lot of uncertainty going forward. So you've got these two very different views of the auto industry, and that's one of the things that's causing a collision course here.
But obviously we see Ford, I guess, I don't know if this is fair, but Ford has been kind of leading the way as far as all the EV talk among the Big Three. GM has come out, Mary Barra has said by 2035 they want their entire fleet to be EV ready. However, Jeff, I have to put an anecdote in there. We ran a story earlier this week that talked about the most stolen cars in America, and one of them, I think two of them were both Dodge Charger models, and the least stolen, Jeff, can you imagine what the least stolen were?
I did the story this morning, so yes, I can imagine it was the Tesla Model 3 and
They
Tesla
were EVs, exactly.
Yeah, but of course, I mean, this isn't like the Maytag repairman where, they're lonely because nobody will even come and steal their vehicles. There are a number of reasons for that. Most among them is that there is a black market for parts of stolen vehicles, for internal combustion parts. There really isn't one yet for EVs, so that makes them less valuable to thieves. The other issue is thieves know if they steal a gasoline-powered vehicle, they can fill it up. If they have to go to a public charger and they steal an EV, that charger may very well know it's a stolen vehicle.
That's very fair, I guess.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily cast a statement as far as the interest in electric vehicles at this point.
No, but a legitimate point here is that none of the traditional car makers are making money on electric vehicles. Ford recently said they expect to lose $4.5 billion on EVs this year. Now, a lot of that is investing money to try to make money down the road, but still, this is one of the things that car makers are worried about, that as we shift more to EVs, they've got to find a way to make a profit on those. And if their costs are higher than a Tesla or a Rivian or a Japanese car maker, then they can't sell their EVs at a competitive price, and that causes problems.
Jeff, as we get to the end of our conversation here today, once again, Jeff Gilbert from WWJ AM Radio in Detroit joining us. We've got until September 14th before we see this contract come to an end. As you have seen this over the years that you've covered this industry, do you think we're headed toward a strike?
Most likely, because that seemed, as I mentioned before, that the two sides are on two very different wavelengths, and also just expectations. I mean, the expectations of members, UAW members, have been raised, and if there isn't a strike, there's going to be difficulty passing a tentative deal because they've been promised so much, and the thought might be, hey, wait a second, if we'd have gone on strike, we could have gotten more. So I would say the odds are heavily in favor of a strike against one or even all three car makers.
Interesting. Always great insight, always great listening to you. And folks, I encourage you, whether you listen to AM radio or not, you should start. You can also check this guy out on Odyssey, the Odyssey app. I want to point that out as well. WWJ Radio 950 AM. Jeff Gilbert is the Auto Beat reporter for them. Jeff, fantastic job. We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. Stay right there. When we come back here on Leading Edge, we will once again talk about the back-to-school thoughts and process that we should all be going through right now, especially when it comes to our kids. Stay right there. Welcome back for a final time here on Leading Edge. Well, I want to give a big thank you once again to Jeff Gilbert for joining us in that first segment. Our next segment, I wanted to focus on this. Maybe you're a parent, maybe you're a grandparent, heck, maybe you're a student. But have you said or heard these words this week? How you doing? Are you all right? Sometimes it becomes white noise, but my next guest is here to share why that conversation is so very important, especially right now. Sonya Quinn from NAMI of Greater Toledo, back on Leading Edge. Good to see you again.
Welcome.
Thank you so much for being here. And we wanted to talk a little bit about that, supporting the back-to-school wellness of everyone. And when we say back to school, we think, okay, this is centrally focused on our kids. It's not, as we're going to point out. But why is it so important to hear those words? How are you? How are you doing? What's going on?
Well, I answer that twofold if I can.
Sure,
It's
absolutely.
important for us to ask that question because you never know what people are going through. You never know how that's going to help them throughout the day, especially children. The second part to that question, the person that is being asked the question should be totally honest. A lot of times you hear that famous, oh, I'm great, oh, I'm doing wonderful. And in reality, we're dealing with something. So it's really important to ask, and it's really important for us to be honest if we're asked that question.
What about kids who are short with their answers and just give you, or good? Do you pry? Do you dive in deeper?
With children, it's a little different because they are different. With children, we should really look at the behaviors. A lot of times they may say, oh, I'm okay, but their behavior is saying something totally different. So it's really important to watch change in children. If they were outgoing and they become quiet or isolated. If they're staying in their room more than usual, if they're not talking to their friends or going out. Those are the kind of things we should pay attention to the children, because more than likely they're not going to tell you what's going on with them.
All right, we wanted to share with people a couple of tips that you guys have followed for years and years and years, but especially important this time of the year. Supporting back-to-school wellness is what we're talking about. And Sonya, we're going to start with the first one. That being, prepare for mixed feelings from students. What does that mean exactly?
A lot of times you're going to see the behaviors of maybe they're acting out, or maybe they're acting one way at home, and then they come to school and they're giving you something totally different. A lot of times what we see, especially with students and teachers and parents, the teacher may say that your child is acting out in school, and the parent go, well, they're not doing that at home. So they're giving that mixed message. They're acting one way at home, but they're acting another way at school. But the most important thing for us to do is make sure that the teacher and parents become allies and write down those different behaviors that they may be seeing, and then come together and have that meeting, and they can find that problem, if you will.
You shared a statistic with me earlier this week, and you said that most mental illness or mental anxiety, the things that should be addressed, start to surface around or even before the age of 14.
6 to 17. And that's the age group, and the 17%, I think I may have told you that in an email, 17% of those individuals start having or noticing those behaviors in the teen years. But 6 to 7 is when we start noticing the behaviors.
Let's go to the next topic that we have there on our list. Once again, supporting back-to-school wellness. Learn warning signs of something more serious.
Again, paying attention to those behaviors. There are signs, and we talk about this all the time in the mental health field, or just in general. There are signs to things happening. We have to slow down and pay closer attention to our child or students. We have to.
But are they? Let me ask you this: are they always going to be those bonk you over the head kind of signs, or just subtle things?
It could be subtle things.
Yeah.
Like I said earlier, it could be like I'm super outgoing. So if someone sees me and I'm really quiet, something's going on.
Yeah.
So that's maybe a sign in a child, if they're outgoing, or if they're not outgoing and all of a sudden they start becoming a bully because maybe they're dealing with something at home and they feel that's the way I can get attention.
We had a story earlier this week, and one of the focuses or one of the points of it was make sure that as a parent, you are not intimidated by staying in contact with the teacher and or the counselor.
Right.
Is that something you guys have to pound into adults' heads, that it's not an intimidation
normally
thing?
when we go out and talk to the schools, that's one of the things we talk about. Again, I said it earlier, becoming allies, a parent and teachers, you know, making sure that you're having those uncomfortable conversations. People just don't want to hear anything negative about their child. Right. But we have to be open to that to better service the child.
We got about a minute and a half. I wanted to go over normalize the conversation.
Yes,
that was the
really
third
important.
point. Define that for us. What does that mean exactly?
Just what it says, normalizing that conversation, having those shared experiences, talking to children and being transparent. A lot of times we try to sugarcoat, if you will.
When I hear normalize, it means don't make such a big deal out of it, right? This is just part of life.
It's part of life. It's just like getting up in the morning and brushing our teeth. You know, we have to allow children to express themselves and not make them feel bad about expressing themselves. Even if it's a negative expression that they're doing, we have to talk to that child, talk to the children, and allow them to know that mental health and the anxiety they may be feeling or any other emotion they may be feeling, it's normal.
And finally,
it's part of life.
Finally, prioritize your mental health as well. We've got about 25 seconds.
That's really important to make sure that we're taking those mental health days, Jeff, to make sure that we take time to take care of ourselves, because if we don't take care of ourselves, how can we take care of our children?
Yeah, and understanding me.
Yes.
And then understanding more of you.
Yes.
That kind of thing. Sonya, great stuff as always.
Thanks,
we
Jeff.
appreciate your insight. You knocked it out of the park.
Thank you.
We'll be back right after this. Welcome back for a final time. Once again, if you have ideas, maybe you have comments about the show that you saw this week, you can email me at jeffsmith@WTOL.com. And you can always check out any past shows on the WTOL 11 YouTube page. We'll see you next time.